Much. So I'm going to share this here. So I reached out to Evelyn. It would have been a while back now after the SolarWinds event started coming to light because I thought it would really benefit folks to have a discussion about managing third-party risk in the kind of wake of what came to light in the SolarWinds supply chain hack. And so I'm going to be coming at this specifically from the perspective of someone who is in the technology and data security space as an attorney, but I'm going to try and make sure that it kind of uses the language also that security folks use, because sometimes we use the same words for different things, and I'll try and make a note when that's something to be aware of, if only for your own internal communication when you're going back and talking about any kind of supply chain risk management program or third-party risk management program. So just at its most basic level, what happened in SolarWinds, most everyone who works in the security space has some idea or at least cognizance of kind of the events that took place. But in effect, SolarWinds was breached most likely by foreign nation state actors. They then unknowingly, for the most part, delivered that vulnerability into their clients. And so from the perspective of the US government, who was the kind of most headline-worthy client, but all of their other clients as well, SolarWinds hack was an example where third-party risk brought a breach into their systems. And we all kind of know the implications for that, the national security implications at the government level, the just data security implications for any corporate entities that were using SolarWinds. And it's really, in my world, brought a focus on how do you manage risk for third-party actors. And so at its broadest level, what is third-party risk? Well, from a security perspective, it's almost always seen as somewhat synonymous with inherited risk, much like the SolarWinds breach, where you have a trusted vendor and they have some kind of a security breach that then gets inherited into your systems. In the legal space, just so you can, that's not going to be the focus, but just so you can understand some folks in your companies, if they come from that perspective, it would also be anything that a company does that has any kind of implication for your organization. So if there's a breach in a vendor and that triggers reporting requirements for your company, because all 50 states have data breach notification statutes now, anything like that would be considered third-party risk as well from our perspective. But I wanted to focus today principally on what it looks like to build out a supply chain risk management program, a third-party risk management program, however your kind of corporate culture describes that, in a world where we know you're going to be required to take what the law calls reasonable efforts, but there's very little guidance on what those efforts are from a legal perspective. So rather than trying to build from scratch, what I want to talk about today are some pre-existing frameworks that we can work from and build from in order to try and secure the systems and meet with the legal requirements that you're going to have for any kind of third-party risk management program. And I hope it's not at this presentation won't be as much of a sleep aid as the NIST documents, but when we get to the Department of Commerce, we will be talking about NIST cybersecurity framework and some of their tools that they have for businesses. So just starting off with the Department of Homeland Security, and much more broadly, the reason why I'm going to federal resources as kind of the building blocks instead of a private organization like CIS, which I think before we started recording, we had mentioned, is from a legal perspective, I would like, if I have to, argue that a company did something and took reasonable efforts, being able to say that they aligned with federal government recommendations when there are no other kind of guidelines to go by is going to be very strong evidence and strong argument on your behalf to show that you're making those reasonable efforts. So the Department of Homeland Security has the National Risk Management Center. It is tasked principally with planning and analysis within the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. That is the agency that, if you were paying attention to some of the news and headlines last year, got in somewhat prominent when its leader, Chris Krebs, made some comments about how secure the elections were. But it's not just focused on election security. It is very much focused on infrastructure security more broadly than just elections. And as part of the National Risk Management Center, they have a task force. Federal government likes very long acronyms. So it's the ICT, Information and Communications Technology, Cyber Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force, which is a very long name for a group, but its goal was to facilitate public-private communication on security risks and to provide tools that would help the federal government, public companies, and privately held companies all have the tools in their toolbox that they need to properly manage any kind of third-party risk or inherited risk from their supply chains. One of the tools that they've created for that is a methodology for assessing organizations' most critical information and communications technology services. It is, a methodology that goes through the analysis of, okay, we need to have these vendors. How should we go about trying to assess which vendor is going to be the most secure for us, or the lowest amount of risk relative to reward? And then we can make a business decision that is risk informed to move forward with that supplier or other kind of vendor. They also developed risk management templates for your vendors. And so if you incorporate these documents into a broader risk management program, that is a very strong way that you can show that you're taking proactive steps towards reasonable efforts at mitigating any kind of third-party risk. These vendor risk management templates should be reviewed in the context of your vendor contracts. And so, as I'll talk about with NIST, building whatever your program is into your contracts is going to be the most surefire way of securing your business interests in the broader supply chain risk management strategy. But it's also going to be very good at setting expectations going forward as you're dealing with your vendors, so that they know what it is that they need to be doing. And the risk management templates are very good for that. One thing that we probably recommend for our clients more often than any other framework is building the NIST cybersecurity framework, and when applicable, any of the other NIST publications, but most commonly the NIST cybersecurity framework, into any kind of data processing agreement or other data protection agreement that is going to be an addendum to the master contract. If you're not familiar with the NIST cybersecurity framework, it goes through several functions that are designed to first identify what your data assets are, walk you through technological, administrative, and physical safeguards that can be used to protect the data, that can be used to detect any kind of anomalies, and to respond when something occurs, and then to recover. Now, when you're negotiating some kind of vendor contract and you want to build that into your risk management program, you're going to want to especially highlight identifying what data is subject to the contract, what protections specifically you are most concerned about, if it needs to be encrypted, if there are role-based restrictions on who should be able to access the data. Any of those technological protocols that you want built in and you want contractual recourse if they don't do, building those in the front end is probably the best way that you can safeguard the business interests of your organization in the event that something doesn't happen, and that then leads to some kind of compromise in your own system. Because once a contract's been breached, foreseeable costs associated with that breach will generally be covered in a breach of contracts claim. Similar with the detect function, you're going to want to build in any kind of reporting. And if you need to know within 72 hours of them discovering some kind of anomalous activity, build that into the contract. If you have kind of done a survey of what the legal frameworks are and you're going to need to talk to a regulator in the event that there's some kind of data breach, setting a time frame up front for the detect and respond functions is going to be absolutely critical for your risk management program when you're dealing with vendors and other third parties. The recovery function, obviously, you usually will not need to build into your contracts, though if you have an exclusive distributor, for example, and your business can't operate without that vendor or that distributor, then you might want to have some kind of requirement that they have recovery procedures in place to not disrupt your business in the event of a data breach. And one of the reasons that I really like the NIST cybersecurity framework from a legal perspective and how you build out a risk management program is that it's been recognized by the state of Ohio, has it as a safe harbor for their requirement that you take reasonable efforts in cybersecurity. And the FTC has looked favorably on it in the same kind of way, that if you're aligning with the NIST cybersecurity framework's principles, then you're going to be typically presumptively reasonable. And so if you're operating in a statutory environment like North Carolina, where we don't have guidance on this is reasonable and this isn't, then aligning with something that other folks have said is reasonable is kind of your best route forward. And it's something that's very easy to build into any kind of addendum to a contract. The National Institute of Standards and Technology also has a Computer Security Resource Center. This center basically takes the NIST cybersecurity framework and similar NIST publications and applies them to the not cyber supply chain, but just broader supply chain risk management programs. And has a lot of good documents for how you can kind of incorporate this into your broader risk management program. Next, looking at the cybersecurity maturity model certification. This is another option. All of these are kind of options that you can look at, not go all in on just the Department of Homeland Security's process, or go all in on the NIST process or the cybersecurity maturity model certification. But you can kind of draw from each of these to build out your own custom third-party risk management program. And so the cybersecurity maturity model certification is a program that was developed by the Department of Defense because they started looking around at their contractors, the defense industrial base, and they had already been requiring certain controls to be implemented, but they were finding increasingly that whenever they exercised one of their audits, they were consistently finding that the self-attested cybersecurity procedures and processes that they were requiring either weren't being implemented or weren't being implemented to their satisfaction. And in a world of SolarWinds, it's not clear that having a cybersecurity maturity model program would have stopped SolarWinds, but having some kind of third-party authentication that the top processes and procedures were being in place would have given us a much better chance of discovering this, because it's leveled 1 through 5. Level 1 are just basic cyber hygiene. That's how it's described. And it's just described as these operations are being performed. Level 2, they're being documented, and it's more or less an intermediate cyber hygiene level. And then level 3, they're being managed. It's good cyber hygiene, and that's the level at which companies can start to bid on contracts that are dealing with any kind of controlled information. It's still unclassified information. To get into the classified information, you need to get higher. But that's the level at which you just have basic level of cyber hygiene that they're confident in. Level 4 is reviewed. It's considered a proactive cyber hygiene level. And then level 5 is optimized, and it's a progressive or advanced cyber hygiene. One of the reasons why this is increasingly an appealing option for a decent number of companies that are looking at building out a risk management program is because you have to have a third party come in and certify this vendor, this supplier is operating at the level of basic cyber hygiene, or is operating at the level at proactive cyber hygiene, level 4. You're not just having to take the word of your vendor, you're getting a third party qualified opinion on the actual conditions on the ground in that company that you're going to be relying on. It's also becoming more and more popular among some of the corporate clients who are doing some corporate procurement from a legal perspective, because you can point to, well, I'm doing what the Department of Defense is recommending and what it will eventually be requiring for all of its procurement efforts. And the Government Accountability Office has begun talking about possibly implementing this in a way that goes much more broadly across the federal government to more technology procurement than just the defense, the Department of Defense. So those are 3 of the federal government kind of frameworks that can be used, and it's going to need to be tailored to your particular vulnerabilities as an organization. If you have an international agreement that's going on, the NIST cybersecurity framework might be an ideal system because it's been recognized by some international bodies as a robust cybersecurity framework that will meet some international standards, not just US standards. If you're in a regulated industry such as banking or healthcare, there are going to be specific laws that you need to comply with and specific protocols you're going to want to implement that are going to be specific to your industry and not necessarily a part of these general, broadly applicable frameworks. But what we know is that the world is still a globalized world. We are still vulnerable to whether it's criminal or nation state or any kind of other malicious actors that are coming in, and we're still reliant on a lot of different suppliers all up and down the supply chain, and at any point some kind of vulnerability can be introduced into plenty of technologies. And so building these into your vendor contracts, into your supplier contracts, in whatever way fits best for your business, and then requiring ideally third-party auditing, and that their subcontractors comply with the same kinds of contractual obligations. That is probably going to be the best way to safeguard the business hit that comes from a data breach, because what we're seeing increasingly is that when a data breach occurs, there's the technical side and there's the just remediating side that you guys are very, very familiar with and do a fantastic job on. There's also the secondary victimization that comes on the administrative side or the legal side, much like the administrative and technological processes you need to put in place for so many of these programs. It's not just technological impacts, it's administrative, that we're seeing an increase in class action lawsuits. We're seeing cyber insurance policies, the premiums are increasing as the judgments in lawsuits are increasing, and the caps on what they're willing to pay are decreasing unless certain metrics are met. For example, of an alignment with NIST or a third-party audit that recognizes basic cybersecurity programs are in place. And so a lot of the cost mitigation that goes into building out a program like this, beyond just the technological, is becoming increasingly tied to the regulatory frameworks that we have, and we're seeing a lot more damages coming out than we used to. And so you guys are on the front lines of that, but these broader programs at a more macro level certainly are kind of spilling over into other areas as well. And so with that, I tried to save as much time as possible just to kind of take your questions. And if you have any, I can't give, like, if I don't know much about your organization, I can't get too in detail, but I want to spend as much time as possible dedicated to just kind of asking any questions that y'all might have and just having a discussion rather than just a monologue on these kinds of topics.
Hey, I have a question, Peter, and I apologize for, I don't really know how to ask what I'm asking. I know earlier on, and apologies for sticking my foot in my mouth on the whole, but you're.
Oh, I was laughing. I was laughing.
I
was on mute, so you couldn't hear. But.
And I like what you said earlier, because you were speaking about, federal recommendations, and that being so important, especially in the case of an incident, or heaven forbid you have something like a SolarWinds occur again. Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask, do you see that, I'm thinking about certain industries where you don't have a direct correlation between NIST recommendations and, the regulatory body. So as an example, and this is a really poor example, because the HIPAA security rule is pretty dated, and yes. It doesn't necessarily call out NIST as far as I'm concerned. But if you have a civil rights investigation, they're going to investigate you against NIST. Yes. Do you see that a framework like NIST becomes, in certain industries, more of a regulated item, actively regulated item? And I apologize for not phrasing that the right way.
No, I appreciate it.
In certain industries.
Yeah, absolutely. So NIST goes out, the organization NIST goes out of its way to say how they are a voluntary, self-regulatory entity, that what they're doing is not giving regulation that has to be followed. Rather, what they're doing is giving guidance for self-regulation. That being said, in reality, you're absolutely correct. There are many industries that if you're not aligned with the NIST cybersecurity framework, you're probably going to be non-compliant, or at least presumed non-compliant until you can prove otherwise. You used the example of HIPAA. HIPAA was passed in 1996, I believe. Obviously, we did not have a whole lot of context for the kind of cybersecurity environment that we currently sit in. But it's the law that we have, and the Office of Civil Rights will do an investigation based on NIST, largely because there's a crosswalk that's been published between the HIPAA security rule and the NIST cybersecurity framework, so that you can kind of see, okay, these sections of the NIST cybersecurity framework will help me align with these sections of the HIPAA security rule. And for anyone who's not in healthcare, the HIPAA security rule is just the regulation that was given based on the HIPAA statute for how covered entities under HIPAA and now their business associates under high-tech have to protect personal health information that the law governs. And so, yes, there are some industries where that's the case. There are also some states like in Ohio, I mentioned, Ohio passed a law that essentially had one requirement: you must take reasonable steps to protect personally identifiable information. But where most states just stopped there, and honestly, where the FTC just stopped there a while back, the Federal Trade Commission, Ohio went a step further and said, okay, here are some frameworks, one of which was NIST and the most accessible of which is NIST. And if you align with those, you have an affirmative defense that, okay, you've been brought to court because someone's upset that you didn't take enough care. You can show that you aligned with NIST. They now have to prove that somehow that wasn't enough, instead of you having to prove that you did do enough. You're presumptively reasonable under Ohio's safe harbor. So it's not just sectorally, but if that kind of a law takes off and becomes more common, which I hope it does, because certainty in the law is always helpful for businesses that are trying to comply with it, then it could be geographically, it becomes more and more of an actual regulation rather than just voluntary self-regulation.
So when you say NIST, I'm one of those dinosaurs, I guess, that still think the risk management framework more than the cybersecurity framework.
Yes.
So are you presumptively okay in some of these cases if you're in an RMF world, or do you have, because literally everything in CSF refers straight back to 853 and same place RMF goes.
So the way that most of these things are written is that they make specific reference to the CSF, the NIST cybersecurity framework. They don't make a reference to the risk management framework, but if you're complying with one, you probably need to have some argumentation that you're compliant, that you are complying with the other. Complying is not the right word, but aligning with the principles of the other. It's not going to be a one-to-one though. You'll need to, they refer specifically to the NIST cybersecurity framework for the most part.
But the translation's not too hard. And it seems like the world is leaving me behind and going CSF, so I guess I'll just have to adapt.
One other question, and one of the things, and again, I'm speaking about maybe my particular post and my areas of responsibility as an InfoSec professional, but one of the things that keeps me up the most at night is third-party risk, and it is the idea that what if my organization, or what if an organization I'm responsible for has partnered up with another company, and we've entrusted our data with another organization, a cloud service, a SaaS service. It doesn't even have to be that big, but
Yeah.
we've entrusted our sensitive data with an organization that mistreats that or does not have those certain controls in place. I'm trying not to say the word SolarWinds, but it could really be any company.
Yeah, no,
I think Mimecast, I saw Mimecast had it was related to SolarWinds towards the beginning of this year. So I know this is a much bigger discussion, and it gets into things like SOC 1, SOC 2, SOC 3, reviewing those reports. But, do you see that for third-party vendors, for hardware, software vendors, that there's some kind of a designation that they could have, some kind of a certification they could receive that states that third-party assessors have looked at their stuff? They've looked at their controls. They've looked at how they perform business, as an example. And for a person like myself that's entrusted the SolarWinds, the Mimecast, I apologize for using that vendor name, but so that if there's a breach of my data, I have that reasonable assurance that you talked about earlier that
Right.
I've onboarded this vendor properly. Do you think that such a certification is going to exist, or does that parallel with a lot of these movements around CMMC and others?
Yeah, so it certainly parallels with the CMMC movement. I think we will eventually get a civilian side CMMC, but for right now, building off of the Department of Defense's work is probably the best way to go, because we don't have it yet, at least not a broadly accepted industry standard. This is who you go to for that kind of certification. What I will say is you put your finger right on one of the largest headaches, which was cloud service, whether it's storage providers or processors of any other kind. It's just a very dominated market, and a couple companies have a huge amount of market power in them. So any individual company that's trying to negotiate into the vendor contract certain new security provisions like a NIST alignment, if they're not already willing to do that, it's very hard to move them because of the market power that something like an AWS or an Azure has in the cloud space. There are some business realities to building out a program like this that sometimes it comes down to market power against market power when you're negotiating a contract, and without any kind of new laws, you need to make a business decision of, do you go to a smaller, likely more expensive cloud service provider who you can negotiate that kind of a provision in with and get contractual assurance that they're taking those reasonable actions, or do you go with a larger, more established company and essentially rest on their, I hate to say rest on their reputation and their need to have strong security provisions in order to have a continued market. But to some extent, that's often what it'll at least look like. But yeah, that particular one that you mentioned, the cloud services, can be a bit of a thorny issue. More broadly, building something in to your contracts is probably going to be your best way to get that assurance until we have a civilian side CMMC type certification body that is more broadly considered an industry standard.
Hey, thank you, Peter. Hearing your answer to that question helps me. I don't want to say I feel better for having that stress, but there's power in numbers, right?
You're not the only one stressing about that by a long shot.
So I was reading an article not long ago talking about third-party relationship management and third-party, I won't call it contact tracing, I guess, where you're going back down down the rabbit hole until you get to the bottom. And they were talking about firmware and drivers, and that they're starting to have more vulnerabilities there, more exploits there, and more attacks there. And I'm having real trouble wrapping my head around anything that would let me get a reasonable assurance that every piece of firmware and every driver and everything in anything is actually is actually okay. Is there hope there?
So when you're talking about when you're talking about not software vulnerabilities, so firmware, there's always kind of the concern that at some point there's going to be a hardware vulnerability that comes in from tampering in one of these huge supply chains that has like 1,000 different steps, and someone could put something in at any point. You're right. There's always going to be that risk. The question is, who's going to bear it? From my perspective, and this may not help the pure how do we prevent unauthorized access, but from my perspective of how do we shift the risk of who bears that danger, that's also a place where if you're highly reliant on particular firmware or drivers or anything else, your supplier for that, assuming it's not commercial off the shelf, in your contract with the supplier, you can allocate, okay, in the event of whatever situation or kind of breach that's causing you concern, we foresee these kinds of damages and you agree to indemnify us to that amount or something along those lines is something that you can use to kind of hedge that risk. It doesn't help you on the technical side. I am fully owning that right up front. But even though you can't necessarily eliminate those technical risks, you can do something on the administrative side to ameliorate its impact on the organization or business. Again, if you have the ability to do so in those agreements.
Right. Because if something like the row hammer things had been more accessible and more exploitable, that would have been just a nightmare. I mean, it was bad enough to worry about, but it could have been way, 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 way worse. Because basically it only affected every Intel-based and compatible CPU out there. So nothing important.
Anyone else? Any questions?
I'm just thinking, like this is internalized threat hunting vendor edition. We need to like name it, just have some escape rooms of how to or something. Just the privacy edition. I don't know.
Evelyn, I'd love to suggest getting Peter to do another workshop again that he did like before the pandemic, if his law firm will let him get away to do it.
We can do it. I can.
Yeah.
He did an excellent job with that, and it was really well received. And to the best of my knowledge, Evelyn, I don't think at least not from the center perspective, I don't think we've done anything like that since then because of the pandemic.
I'd be happy to.
Guys, Peter is the real deal. He has done 8-hour workshops getting in and out of the contracts, privacy, data topics, all centered around cybersecurity. It's amazing to hear you, like you were talking about in the beginning, speaking this language. I'm glad you're bilingual when it comes to privacy and what the cybersecurity folks are dealing with all the time. And that's not the first time, Jason, or the third time he's asked for another workshop from you. So I'm feeling the pressure. Message received. We'll
I'm
do
happy
it.
to, anytime y'all want.
Let's put it on the calendar after the conference. How about that? The summit.
Evelyn, I'd suggest, I know it may not work this year, having him do a workshop like that, even if it's a pared down version of it during the workshop, because we have all this technical education plan, but nothing like this that's more legal and compliance oriented.
Right. Yes, I agree. And I think one of the things that you really learn in his workshop and each individual module, it is the wide openness of the things that we're not considering. So while a lot of people on this call are technical, as this spills over into the contractual or the legal threat, it is quite expansive. And once you start getting some revelation as to, like Robert was referring to, the rabbit trail, because once a breach happens, the finger pointing, because I worked in hospitals when the hospitals were getting nailed to the wall, their names were being put out, the fines were flying. I mean, and then they figured out, well, I can, as a sort of insurance, transfer the blame, not to the insurance company, but to the next guy. Well, you had your fingers in the pot, so why don't you help prove that it wasn't you, type thing. So definitely, I like what you said about, having some structure in place to say, well, we did follow the NIST rules. So now it's your responsibility to prove that I didn't do enough, and that'll keep them busy. That'll keep you busy. Any other questions? You better ask while we have Peter.
I think this is a fantastic presentation, and really, I think it highlights a couple things. It highlights gaps in our current. I know I keep going back to third-party risk, but but it also helps us to understand these reasonable assurances that we can provide, and why. Here I am eating my words again. Why a set of recommendations like what NIST has provided are so incredibly useful for giving those assurances. So phenomenal presentation. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. And one thing else that I will add, since I know security folks always need ammunition when they're going into boardrooms or what have you, and advocating for whether it's more resources or anything else. Increasingly, what we're seeing is that large companies that your organizations might want to do business with, might be seeking any kind of contracts from them. Increasingly, they're looking for those kinds of assurances in their contracts I was talking about. And if you can proactively have that already in place, they'll not have nearly as much heartburn when they're trying to grab a large client that's then going to require a lot of that of them. And so to the extent that can help you as well, wanted to share that.
Peter, before, and I know you did not, you are coming on here solely education wise and trying to help us understand some of the nuances here, but can you tell us how your company can help in a time? I think it's so important to build relationships in peacetime so that when there's war, you're like, oh my gosh, I need Peter, or I need help, just to bounce a question, how can you help?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're a full service law firm in Warden Smith. I'm based out of Raleigh. And I'm probably we don't have a Triad office, but I live in Burlington, so I can get just about anywhere in the Triad easily enough. We're a full service law firm. We help with any kind of vendor review, redlining any contracts that you might have. If you wanted someone to kind of tackle the legal side of building out a third party risk management program or a supply chain risk management program, we could do that. We have a consulting side as well as our legal office. And so anyone who's concerned about lawyers cost a lot, typically, especially when we bill by the hour on the consulting side, we do flat fees based on whatever the project scope is. So that's more or less a lot of the stuff that I was talking about today. I've done every single piece of that can help clients with that as well. So not all the technological stuff that I was talking about, but a lot of the administrative and risk analysis I can help with as well. And then if you have any issues that are not specific to privacy or data security, like I said, we're a full service law firm, so any other kind of business risks, business problems that you have, we can handle.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so
And
much.
thank you for asking.
sharing. Yeah. Well, you know, when you need help, you definitely want to know who you can trust and where to go. So thank you for sharing that. Any other questions?
Absolutely.
All right. Well, if there's no other questions, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank y'all for having me.
We will do a workshop. We'll put something together and figure out, you know, time-wise what's appropriate. And then please be looking out for the Security Summit information that's coming out. It's going to move pretty quickly here. I'm just waiting for maybe 2 more topics, and then we'll launch the signups so that you can register. Please share that with everybody. It's free. Share it on LinkedIn. Invite your coworkers. There's topics for everyone, and hearing from the security professionals in the region is really something powerful. Folks that have been in their seats for a long time they have a lot of wisdom to share. So with that, everybody have a great evening, a good weekend, and we will be in touch.
Thank y'all.
Thanks, Peter. Bye, all.
Bye-bye. Thank you.